Today I want to present about a topic that has been of recently increasing research interest to me, and that is NLP law and the quest for a legal language model. I put a little quote here from Oliver Wendell Holmes, who was a Supreme Court justice, and it seems like a pretty prescient quote. You know, he says, "For the rational study of the law, the black letter man may be the man of the present, but the man of the future is the man of statistics." And as you can see, this is kind of relevant to the idea of using neural networks and machine learning models in the law. So I think it's important to really have a solid definition of what natural language processing is. If you go to Wikipedia, the definition will be a subfield of linguistics, computer science, and artificial intelligence concerned with the interactions between computers and human language. And this field used to be very much based on raw statistics, you know, counting word frequencies and part of speech frequencies and whatnot. But nowadays it's been increasingly dominated by neural networks and deep learning, which kind of learn rules themselves in a way. And that idea is called kind of feature learning, if you will. And some normal canonical NLP tasks include sentiment analysis, where you judge, you know, how positive or negative a certain piece of text is, question answering, where you give a model some kind of question and you hope for an answer. It's pretty self-explanatory. And summarization, where a model will take in a large amount of text and output some kind of summary, whether that summary is extracting pieces of the most important text or abstracting a completely new text that describes that in simpler terms. Now, I really want to motivate the idea of using NLP in the law, because I think this can kind of be overlooked in the rush to just apply machine learning everywhere. But there really is an argument that law is a particularly good domain for NLP. And I break this argument down to a few places. One is that law is governed by language, and we by extension are governed by language. You know, law is a big network of documents, as I wrote here, and from an NLP, from a computational perspective, that is kind of a powerful thing, and it's something to really keep in mind. There's also something about the style of legal language that seems to be well suited towards this kind of computational approach. And that's the idea that legal language is precise, repetitive, and often formulaic. And while that might seem like, you know, those words almost might seem to have a negative connotation, for us, for machines, that means that it's easier to actually like piece apart meaning and really have a rich understanding of this well-structured language. And then there's the idea that there's just so much legal language out there from hundreds of years. But there's just a few core ideas at play that are kind of repeating themselves and changing over time. And if you can pinpoint those changes over time, you have a good understanding of the law. And then there's this point about the philosophy of both of these, which is something that didn't really come to me when I was making this presentation, but I saw when I was reading an article by Forbes. And this idea is that machine learning and law operate according to strikingly similar principles. They both look to historical examples in order to infer rules to apply to new situations. And, you know, it's a really interesting analogy, because that's kind of what we want our legal machines to do, is do law well. And if machine learning is based on that idea, and so is law, then it almost seems like, you know, the models that we're creating are well suited towards this pursuit. So I want to go over this roadmap in kind of a pretty well-structured way. And this is something I pulled from a paper about legal artificial intelligence. And so you can see the center here is applications of legal artificial intelligence. And on the side, we have two different kinds of methods. But first, let's focus on the actual applications. So you have judgment prediction, which we have an example of. For instance, if you are given a fact description of a case, or the model is given a fact description of a case, we want that model to be able to predict what the actual ruling will be in that case. And that would entail, for example, citing relevant law articles, picking out exactly the charges, and figuring out the terms of penalty. And of course, this is a very complicated task and something that judges, you know, train to do. And it's not something that really has a well-cut answer. But there's this idea that if you can predict what a judge will do and what humans will do, then you have some kind of leg up in the legal world, and you could do things and you could pursue cases that you know will succeed, perhaps. So this idea of like pattern recognition of cases is actually like really powerful, and it's something that can make change. If you're thinking about trying to change statutes for social reasons, or it could also just be something that could make a lot of money potentially. Then there's the idea of legal question answering, which is kind of the idea of like, the same way a lawyer will give consultation, you can kind of train a machine to do that perhaps. Similar case matching, which is kind of relevant to this judgment prediction task in a way, because if a lot of law is about looking to past, looking to precedent, and seeing how we can apply precedent to the situation that is currently at hand. And then there's the idea of summarization, right? Like, as we mentioned, there's just a lot of legal stuff out there. Contracts can be like hundreds of pages. And for humans, what's relevant to us is that we want, a clean summary of what's going on. We want the core ideas that are relevant to us. And, machines, we can train machines to do that. And they might not be great at it, but, the whole point is that we're working on it. We're trying to make this do well. Now, I think we should focus on the two different branches of methods in this world of legal AI, which kind of extends to broader AI and machine learning and natural language processing in general. And these two methods are symbol-based and embedding-based. And as you can see, the examples they give for symbol-based include relation extraction, where you see language and you pick apart like the different relations between people, usually using just like pattern rules. So for example, if the words are married and have a son, then you can quickly create that kind of association between Alice and Bob, and that Dave is the son of each one, and whatnot. There's also ideas of creating like events and timelines from the facts, either like by hand, usually by hand, or by some kind of automated way of looking at the language. And then element detection. And so these symbol-based methods are kind of generally considered like old school NLP, but they're also in industry, they're kind of the standard right now. And because they're generally pretty safe, reliable, and they're statistical. And what that means is that they're explainable. Like we kind of know what's going on when we train. And this is not the idea to recognize here is that these are not like neural nets. These are kind of statistical methods that will pick out like well-defined patterns. But what that means is, at the cost of being safe and reliable, they're also quite limited in how much they can do, and how much kind of creativity perhaps they can employ. On the other side, we have embedding-based methods, which are kind of like the bread and butter of like research and academia nowadays in natural language processing, and specifically legal NLP. And some of these ideas are concept embeddings, which we'll talk more about embeddings later in this talk. The idea of concept knowledge graphs, so like picking apart ideas and really trying to put them together into large kind of networks. And then there's the idea of pre-trained language models, which will be kind of the main focus of this talk. But I just want to comment that like these embedding-based methods, they're complicated. They're kind of unreliable sometimes, as we just kind of talked about in the last presentation. And they're mostly based on neural networks. But as a cost for this, there's also something mysterious and promising about them, because they seem to have this kind of abstract ability that humans have with their own brains. And there's this idea that if we can keep improving these embedding-based methods, they can eventually beat symbol-based methods, and they can do amazing things. And we've already seen them do amazing things. And it's important to realize that both of these methods can feed into these same kinds of tasks. And you see different pros and cons to having each one. But today I want to talk specifically about pre-trained language models, because that might not be something that we covered too in depth in these courses, but they are kind of like the state of the art in research in regards to embedding-based natural language processing. And this might be confusing to see this Muppet, not Muppet, this children's show character here. And this is where I want you to meet BERT. And I don't mean BERT from Sesame Street. I mean BERT, the language model, which BERT is an acronym for this word, bidirectional encoder representations from transformers. That's fine if that sounds like gibberish to you. That you know, to really understand each of those words will take quite a while. But what's important here for us to know is that BERT is a language model, and a language model is, in a rigorous mathematical sense, it's something that models a probability distribution over a vocabulary. You don't really have to know what that means too well to understand it, but practically what a language model can do is that it has a strong quantitative understanding of language and how it's distributed, and that can help play into other tasks. But language modeling itself is a task, and it's important to keep that in mind. So for example, if you see here, the core language modeling task is giving the model a sentence, taking out a word, and then making it guess what that word is. Oh, and like it'll create a probability distribution over the entire vocabulary as to what that word should be. And so you see here, it takes in how are mask doing today. And if you feed it through this BERT masked language model, what it does is it will give you the right answer. It'll say, I mean, and it's just because, this case is, well suited and stuff, but BERT tends to do actually really well in this task. And it'll say like, how are you doing today? It'll give the correct answer here. And what's important to keep in mind is that this is a task. This is what BERT is trained on. And it's really powerful that you can train something like a large model on something as simple as language modeling, because all you have to do is take a large corpus of text and then run that over and over again, right? And you could easily just pick out words and create your test data very easily, or your training data very easily. So you can really, really train these things because there's just so much data available. So let's talk a little bit more about like why language models are powerful and how we can use their general, predictive powers for other things. And the trick is that, okay, to understand like what BERT is, first of all, it's a complicated neural network known as a transformer. But the beauty of it is that we really don't really need to know what goes on here. We can almost treat it like a black box over, as it processes this language, it runs the language through this, complicated neural structure. And what's important is that after we train this task on this language modeling task, we can harvest the weights of this model and use them as word embeddings, essentially. And this is something that was done with this is something you could do with normal neural nets as well. This is something that was done before. It just happens to be that BERT, and this specifically this bidirectional transformer encoding tends to be really good at creating word embeddings. And essentially what you do when you have these large language models, the reason that they can apply to so many tasks is because when we harvest those word embeddings, we can use them as inputs into any kind of neural network we want. And essentially this leads to a sort of like plug and play sort of ideal, if you will, where we can add a few extra layers to our model. We can create any kind of output, and then what we do is we train it, we fine tune it. That's really the term, because BERT is a pre-trained model, but we fine tune it on a specific task. For example, we fine tune it on judgment prediction. So we give it a this corpus, this training set of judgment prediction, and then it'll do that specific task. And what the idea is that it will get good at that, but it'll get good at that with the baseline of having BERT, which is a really good baseline understanding of language itself, right? And this idea of taking BERT and applying it to, or just any kind of language model and applying it as like a baseline, like part of your system to a different task, is known as transfer learning. And the reason this has garnered so much attention is because this method of transfer learning just happens to work really well. And it's achieved state of the art on a lot of different tasks, both, in general NLP, but also like legal NLP. So obviously BERT is not the only language model. And people like to comment that there's kind of this new Moore's law going on, where we're having larger and larger language models. And what's happening is that they seem to actually be doing better and better the bigger they get. And, a really important observation for us today is that these large language models are trained on really large general corpora. such as Wikipedia or books or news or like just web scraping. And what that means is that they have an understanding of general, like, commonly used language by like, most people. But what's kind of an open question is how well these models can specialize, right? Because like, let's say we have BERT that's trained on normal language. What if we want to fine tune it on some kind of legal task? Will it do as well if it was trained on say like the general form version of that task, like in a, would it do better on general stance detection or legal stance detection, for instance? And there has been some research on this, although not a lot. And I specifically point to this 2020 paper, which discusses 3 methods for taking BERT and applying it to legal domains. The first is to take the general BERT and then simply fine tune it on the legal task, which is kind of the naive way of doing it. You also have a way, this is called like further pre-training, where essentially you have the pre-trained BERT, and then you also pre-train it on some domain corpora. And what I mean by that is, so let's say this part, at this stage, it's trained on Wikipedia and whatnot. And on this stage, it's trained on, say, EU legislation and UK legislation. And it does the same kind of masked language modeling task, except on this kind of language rather than this kind of language. And then there's a whole other way altogether where you ditch this generalized pre-training and you just train immediately on the domain corpora. And for this was the corpora they used for this task. And then you fine tune on the legal specific task. And the results were not really that clear. They're like the winner actually changed depending on the data set that you used, which is kind of an unsatisfying answer in the research world. And further research has still not given a compelling answer. People, it's like Zhang, have created like even new kinds of legal BERT with slightly different kinds of pre-training tasks. And it's still, there hasn't been a clear winner. There hasn't been a clear replicable winner as to who in this field. So it's still kind of an open research question. And very recently, in some research I've been working on, I've been considering an entirely different way for training a model on a specific legal task. And the way I do this is I leverage this idea that if you have a certain legal task, you might have a general version of that task that you can train on first. So for instance, in this specific research setting, I was thinking about stance detection, the idea that, how can you look at a piece of text and determine a topic and then determine how that text feels about that topic. And there are lots of large data sets that work with this task in regards to like general political ideas. But I created a legal version of the task that is based on judging how a written opinion in a legal case feels about a specific topic. And so my idea was, instead of doing just this like legal pre-training to fine-tuning or the general pre-training to fine-tuning, my idea was to pre-train the general model and then fine-tune on the general task first. And then you fine-tune on the legal task, but you use this, you have this additional kind of like part of the model being changed, and that's something called a legal adapter. I don't have much to go into this. I mean, really, the legal adapter is like my own term of art. Really, the term here is adapter, to keep in mind. And adapters are essentially, they were originally introduced to help models change languages. So for example, if I trained a model on English and I wanted to actually start doing stuff in Spanish, there's this part of the network where I can just like kind of plug in a new part of it, and it could then translate all of its English stuff into Spanish. And it doesn't have to do some extra Spanish training in order to just make that kind of domain transfer. So my idea is, if legal language is really its own kind of language, then this idea of using an adapter should work, and it should help us go from this general version of the task to a specific legal version of the task. And these experiments are still in progress, but it has seemed that the legal, in certain areas, this legal domain, like this legal domain adapter, has actually worked better than the existing methods. But there's still a bit more work to be done. So let's just step back to conclude from this talk. What I really want you to take away is that law and NLP really do go hand in hand, even if, this discussion of like generalized language models may have taken away from that. There's something to say about how language models dominate for general language tasks, and a kind of open question as how we can specialize these general language models to specialized NLP tasks, such as the law. And there's really no consensus on this right now. It's really kind of an open research question. And then there is, this idea that, language models, maybe they even aren't the move. Maybe the fact that they have this kind of, inconsistent kind of behavior is something that might frustrate you, and it frustrates me. And, that's why, there's still work in this field, and there's still more to consider. So that is where I will end this talk. Thank you all for listening.